Do you want to start coloring your drawings but you don't really know where to start? Or maybe you want to brush up on your shading techniques? I'm going to share 3 secret techniques that I use to add color to my drawings, and also share some theory and knowledge that I use to help my illustrations stand out. Let's get started. We'll start with this, the simplest kind of shading. It's commonly called cel shading, short for celluloid, named after the transparent sheets that were once used in 2D animation, since that's where this shading style was first popularized. I think it's pretty clear to see that the parts that are in shadow are darker than those in light. But before we can get to the actual shading techniques and shading methods, we have to answer an important question. Where exactly are you supposed to put these shadows? If we look at this illustration, the shadow shape looks so complicated. In order to figure this out, the first thing we have to think about is light. And lighting can of course get very complicated, but we'll think about the simplest scenario, a single primary light source. This makes it easier to figure out where the shadows should go. We'll start by thinking about some basic geometric shapes like a sphere, cone, and cube. And the shadows look like this. Of course, this changes with the position of the light. And if we draw a wireframe on top to look at the planes, notice that the planes facing away from the light source are the ones in shadow. These shadows are called form shadows. We can keep this in mind to help place shadows on more complicated structures as well, such as human faces and bodies. We can try imagining a wireframe on those structures, or try to break them down into shapes you're more familiar with to estimate where the shadows might be. But form shadows aren't the only shadows there are. We also have cast shadows. We cast shadows on the ground, which I'm sure we're all well aware of, but also on ourselves. This can be pretty tricky to calculate, which is why it's important to gradually develop a sense of 3D space. That's why I like to recommend that people draw boxes, but that's a topic for another video. Let's focus on how we can achieve a result like this. Let me introduce you to the first of the 3 secret techniques, layer styles. Okay, that's actually not a secret at all, but this is YouTube, so I gotta ham it up at least a little bit. Let me explain. First, I like to start by doing a sketch and then doing clean lines on top of that. Then I create a layer below my lines. You can use any drawing application for this, but I'm using Clip Studio Paint. On that layer, I add my flat colors. These are also known as local colors, which is the true color of whatever it is you're drawing. Because it's below my line art layer, I don't have to worry about coloring over my lines. You can just color them in like you would a coloring book using your brush, but oftentimes digital apps have tools to help make it easier. For instance, the bucket tool or the lasso tool. Some people like to separate every color into its own layer, but I find that having too many layers is confusing. So I like to do all my flat colors on one layer. Once you've done that, we can now create a new layer on top of your flat colors and change the blending mode to multiply. There's some math behind it, but in short, anything you put on this layer will darken the layer below it. This makes it super easy and convenient to paint shadows. Typically though, you don't just want to pick some shade of gray, but we want a bit of color in our shadows. Painting with just gray or black can make your shadows look dull or muddy. But what color should you pick? It's really up to you, especially if you're not drawing your character in a background. Typically, I like to pick a bluish color. That's because shadows are often affected by ambient light bouncing around. And in an outdoor setting, that ambient light is going to be the same color as the sky, which is blue. However, this usually doesn't look very good on skin in general. Shadows on skin tend to be warmer due to subsurface scattering. That's a big word, I know, but that basically means that light is partially absorbed by skin, bounces around a little bit in the blood and tissue, and then bounces back out. You can see this most clearly when you hold your hand up to the light. And because of that, I like to make sure that the shadows on the skin are a little bit reddish. But even after all of that, sometimes with only 2 colors, I feel like this looks a little boring. Isn't there anything we can do to make this look more interesting? Thankfully, yes. One thing I really like doing is varying the local colors a little bit. Instead of having just flat colors, I like using the airbrush to brush in some variations. For example, I like adding some redness on the nose and cheeks. I also like to lock the transparency of my shadow layer and brush in some soft gradients there as well, and instantly this makes it look a little bit more dynamic. Another thing we can do is add highlights. I make a separate light layer on top to add rim light or some highlights, especially on the hair. As for the blending mode for this, I find that screen, overlay, or add all work fine. Experiment to see what you like. In particular though, I really like the hard light layer style because it's a combination of multiply and screen in one layer. This is pretty convenient if you're like me and you get confused by having too many layers. But what if this isn't enough? What about soft shading? Real life isn't all just hard shadows like this. But before we can get into soft shading, I think it's important to understand the basics of how shadows work. Let's take a look at form shadows again and break it down further. Notice that this part of the shadow, closest to the light, actually tends to be the darkest. This is called the core shadow, or terminator. But why is it the darkest? Why is it lighter here? This is due to the reflected light. Remember, that light can bounce off surfaces to lighten the shadow a bit. In this case, it's kind of bouncing off this imaginary white table. But it's important to make sure that this reflected light isn't too bright, since it'll never be as bright as the direct light source, and that cast shadows can also be affected by that reflected light. There's also a different kind of shadow that I haven't talked about before, and I think this shadow is actually the most important shadow to remember if you want your shading to look lifelike and 3D. Occlusion shadows. This type of shadow has nothing to do with the direction of the light. Basically, it's a very dark shadow that occurs when two surfaces are close together or touching. And it happens because light can't get into these tiny little crevices. I find that including these shadows can make a big difference. You either add them onto a new layer, or sometimes I like to incorporate it into line art by blending and smudging the lines a little bit. But there's still one important key difference between this and this. And that's, of course, because of the edges. There are different types of edges. Hard edges, which imply a sharper corner, and soft edges, which represent softer curves, and some weird in-between edges as well. If we want to start softening those edges, we can either use an airbrush to do it, or use blending tools to start softening those hard edges. But we do have to be careful here, because there is a trap, one that I personally completely fell into. When I first started doing soft shading, I really admired beautifully rendered pieces like this, or this. I really wanted to achieve this kind of almost soft, ethereal look, so I started softening and blending out all of my edges. But strangely enough, when I started blending out the edges in my illustrations, it didn't look like this. It looked blurry or even muddy. It felt flat instead of soft. Why is that? To find out, if we take a closer look at some of these gorgeous illustrations, we notice that not all of the edges are soft. It's important to remember that contrast and variety in edge types are important to make your illustration look appealing. Layering all these multiply and hard light and overlight layers works pretty well, but I realize it has a pretty major weakness. Let's say there's a specific color you want to use. With all these blending layers stacked on top, it can be pretty hard to predict what the final color is going to be. Besides, isn't that overcomplicating things? It would be easier if you can simply pick a color and apply it to your drawing, right? And you can absolutely do that. This is the even less secret technique number 2. Just do it. Just create a layer you want to add color to, don't touch the blending modes, select a color from your color picker, and just start painting. When you want to add shadows, grab a darker color and paint it on top. Simple, easy, is what I wish I could say, because I actually find this really, really hard. Let's go back to picking shadow colors. I said it should be darker, but like, how much darker? Should we move it to the left? To the right? Maybe we should change the color a little bit? What's the right color to pick? So this is where color theory comes into play. All colors have 3 important properties. Hue, represented by where on the color wheel it is. Saturation, or how vibrant or colorful the color is. Moving to the right makes the color more saturated. And finally, value, or brightness. This is how light or dark a color is. Moving upwards makes the color brighter. It's worth noting, though, that of course there are different color pickers depending on your drawing application of choice. Saturation or lightness might be arranged differently or in reverse, but hopefully you still get the idea. You can even use these sliders to pick your colors instead, which is what I personally prefer using. But as I was saying, color theory is complicated. This is all only scratching the surface. Lots of things affect the color of a shadow, such as ambient light, material, and to know all this requires a lot of study and practice that I haven't done yet. So honestly, I rarely use this technique simply because I don't understand color very well. The only time I do is when I have some kind of clear color reference. So for me, it's definitely easier to tackle all this hue, saturation, and value stuff one step at a time. And out of these 3 things, one is actually the most important for making striking illustrations, and that is value. Values are probably the most crucial thing when it comes to the overall readability of a composition. But how can we make sure our piece's values are good? One simple way of checking is to simply convert our illustration to black and white. Create a layer on top with the blending mode set to color or saturation. Then you simply fill the whole layer with black. Then zoom out to check that everything is still readable when the piece is small. Due to kind of complicated color theory reasons, this won't be a completely accurate representation of the true values, but it's probably close enough for our purposes. However, having to check the values over and over again can get pretty annoying. If values are so important, wouldn't it be easier to design a drawing around values from the ground up? And fortunately, there is a way to do this. Introducing the not-so-secret technique number 3, grayscale to color. This method seems like magic sometimes. Instead of going straight in with flat colors, I start with shades of gray. Then I gradually blend and soften my edges as needed. When I'm satisfied with how my painting looks in black and white, then I can start adding color. Once again, we can use the power of layers with blending modes here. By creating a layer on top with the color blending mode, we can paint on top to colorize the image. Then a little bit of refining and done. Except if anyone has tried this method, then they know it's not so easy. One really common issue that a lot of people seem to encounter when adding colors is that it looks really washed out or muddy even. Here's an example. Let's say you want to color in this circle a vibrant yellow color. So you create a color layer on top, pick the most intense yellow color you can, and oh, that does not look very vibrant. How can you make the yellow look less dirty? The answer? You can't. At least, not without some changes to your grayscale painting. Something important to realize is that different hues have max saturation at different values or brightnesses. You can easily make the same circle a bright red, but for yellow, you'll need to make that gray lighter. So what does that mean for us? When doing our grayscale painting, we can't just paint without thinking. We have to know in advance what color things are going to be and how saturated we want those colors. And I actually find this pretty hard, but luckily for me, there is a way of making it just a bit easier. The color layer blending mode is very unforgiving, so I actually prefer to use the overlay layer. The overlay layer basically works like the hard light layer, except with the layer order reversed. And the nice thing about it is that you don't have to be quite as precise with your values. You can still adjust them as you add color. It does, however, mean I need to occasionally change the piece to grayscale to make sure I haven't changed my values too much. There's also one key tip to remember to prevent muddiness. Make sure the shadows are a different color to the light. Change the saturation and the hue a little bit. And don't forget that once the base colors are down, you can paint on top of everything else to refine things and really tie things together and get those details just right. And there you have it, the 3 not very secret techniques that I like to use to color and shade my drawings. Keep in mind that these are just the 3 I prefer using, and there are a lot of other ways of going about coloring. But I hope they served at least as a useful starting point. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!